Today we're back for another Know Your Foe video, where we're going to try and uncover some of the Thousand Sons' nastiest tricks to better prepare people for meeting them on the tabletop. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. So as armies go, the Thousand Sons are a fairly complicated one, and a lot of their strength comes from various fairly complex psychic powers that the vast majority of people who don't collect the faction won't necessarily have the best grip on, so it can lead to some surprises on the tabletop. In this video we're going to talk over a general faction overview of the Thousand Sons, what sort of things you need to look out for most in game, and a quick overview of the various cults of magic that the Thousand Sons gained in Ritual of the Damned. There's quite a lot to talk about, so let's jump straight into it with a look at their general faction abilities. So any full Thousand Sons detachments get the Brotherhood of Sorcerers special rule that increases the range on all of their psychic powers by 6 inches. This is just really handy for casting any sort of debuffs or magic missiles at the enemy, but it's particularly potent when you combine it with Smite, particularly as per Psychic Focus, the Thousand Sons still casts on 5s every single time. 24-inch range Smite means that if you have a collection of Thousand Sons sorcerers, they can put you under a withering hail of mortal wounds if they should choose to focus on casting Smite for a turn or two. This means that it's going to be extra potent against any elite armies that you have, things where you pay quite high points cost per wound, and certainly if you have the option for throwing chaff troops in front of your army to take some mine bullets, then this can be a good way to blunt their damage output. When standard marines gained shock assault and bolter discipline, these guys gained hateful assault and malicious volleys, so their units are more potent on the charge than they would have been before, and it's really quite helpful with their inferno bolters, which means they can put out quite a decent hail of fire all the way out to 24 inches, which is particularly scary as Inferno Bolters always have AP -2, as do the Inferno Combi Bolters. This one definitely gave their standard Rubrics and Terminators a big buff. I think stratagems are one of the most important places where you can get caught out if you don't know what's coming. As with all Chaos, they have access to the excellent Veterans of the Long War, which is just +1 to wound for a unit in a phase, whether that's shooting or assault, and is one of the better stratagems that Chaos have to offer. For other damage output, their Zangor units can fight twice for just 2 command points, so you can expect them to be using that a little bit more than the standard 3 command points that it is for most factions, and they really can dish out quite a lot of strength 4 AP -1 attacks. They have the ability to deep strike with infantry units, where you can either choose to put 1 or 3 units in deep strike with 1 to 3 command points, so you could potentially have Zangors or Rubric Marines dropping up from an unexpected angle. And they really have all manner of stratagems to help them manipulate their own psychic phase. Each of these are 1 command point stratagems, but over the course of a psychic phase, they can cast an extra power, have +2 to cast on a sorcerer, change a power with a Chaos Familiar, which can get you any one of 18 different powers, and allows them access to the Chaos Demon's Discipline of Tzeentch. Their Psykers can also heal D3 wounds on themselves if they manage to cast on a 9+, and you can pay command points to ignore perils of the warp as well, which is always handy. Basically, if they have enough command points, they'll pretty much be doing what they want in the psychic phase. From Ritual of the Damned, they gained a bunch of special stratagems to help out their Rubric Marines. Indomitable Foes is an excellent defensive buff, giving the Thousand Sons +1 to their invul save, typically meaning that they'll have a 4+ invul save. Risen Rubricae is an interesting one that allows you to deploy the Rubric Marines outside of their deployment zone, much in the same way as Space Marine Scouts deploy. That can be quite a scary threat when you have up to 20 of the things right in your face from turn 1, meaning they're going to be getting the first strike on you with those Inferno Bolters. Finally, another important one to know that exists is Yoked Automata, and this one comes into effect if you charge one of the Thousand Sons players' characters. If they have a Rubric or Scarab Terminator unit within 12 inches, then they can use this stratagem to heroically intervene a massive 2d6 inches towards your unit, which means that you could very well be fighting that unit in addition to the character that you charged, so it's very important to know that this one exists if that is going to make a difference. As we mentioned, a lot of their strength comes from the psychic powers, and the Thousand Sons typically have access to their own Discipline of Change and the standard Dark Hereticus discipline from Chaos Space Marines. In the Discipline of Change they get access to Doom Bolt, which is a very high warp charge psychic power, but if it goes off then it both deals mortal wounds and also massively slows the unit that it targets, which can be a real issue if you do need to get a certain unit up to the fight. Glamour of Tzeentch is another really useful one at warp charge 7, and still make a unit within 18 inches -1 to hit. You could potentially stack that with Weaver of Fates, which is one that gives +1 to the invul save to make an incredibly durable unit. Say for example, if you did use a big unit of Risen Rubricae in the midfield, the Thousand Sons player could potentially cast both Weaver of Fates and also Glamour of Tzeentch, and then use the stratagem to give them +1 invul, so you've got a massive unit of -1 to hit, and also with a 3+ invul save. Those guys would most certainly not be going away anytime soon. They've also got Temporal Manipulation, where they can heal D3 wounds, and then from the Dark Hereticus discipline they've got access to the absolute gem of Warp Time, which allows you to zoom big scary units all around the board, such as Demon Princes for example. Prescience to give one of these big scary Death Star units +1 to hit, and also Death Hex to potentially thwart the invul saves of the opponent. I have seen the Thousand Suns players use a Chaos Familiar to swap out to the Discipline of Tzeentch power, Gaze of Fate, which basically gives you 1 extra reroll per turn, so it can be helpful for casting future psychic powers, or potentially just translating into a little bit of extra damage output somewhere important in the army. On top of all this, there's absolutely tons of mortal wound psychic powers that they can use, such as Tzeentch's Firestorm, Infernal Gaze, and potentially Infernal Gateway from the Discipline of Tzeentch, which is a really powerful one that has the potential to throw around D3 mortal wounds to the unit that targeted, and a further D3 mortal wounds to every enemy unit that's within 3 inches of it, so you could be throwing around a lot of mortal wounds for just 1 cast. In combination with Smite, the Thousand Suns really do have the tools to be able to hoover whole units off the table just in the psychic phase. In terms of an overview of their units, their core troops choice are the Rubric Marines. These are essentially Space Marines with a 5+ invul save, AP-2 Inferno Bolters, and mini Smite per the squad that only does 1 mortal wound under normal circumstances, and from their All Is Dust rule they get +1 to their save if they're shot by a damage 1 weapon. They are 16 points though, so all this does come at a price, and they are only 1 wound, meaning that mass fire will usually bring them doon if you do happen to be saving on a 2+. They can also take the slightly fearsome Warp Flamers, which do massively increase the cost of the unit, but you can potentially have an entire unit of AP-2 Flamers, which certainly has the potential to be very scary on that Risen Rubric unit, and could do a lot of damage to the enemies in the deployment zone. Scarab Occult Terminators are basically the Terminator equivalent of Rubric Marines. They come armed as standard with a Power Sword and an Inferno Combi Bolter, which is essentially a Storm Bolter with AP-2. Again, they get All Is Dust, so you're really not going to shift them anytime fast with damage 1 weapons, but they're not particularly more durable against higher AP ones. They will do more damage at range point for point than the standard Rubric Marines, particularly as they can move and fire with those Inferno Combi Bolters at 24-inch range, but they are a little bit more efficiently cleared with anti-tank weapons. Having Deep Strike is helpful though, and having that stratagem that adds 1 to their invul save is certainly helpful. Zangors received a bit of a nerf in the latest chapter approved, going up to 8 points, which means that we're not seeing them quite as much about at the moment. They're a melee infantry demon unit, with 2 attacks at strength 4 and AP-1. Their Brayhorn can give them +1 to the charge, which can be particularly helpful if they are coming out of Deep Strike, either through the Webway Infiltration or the Dark Matter Crystal Relic, which we'll get onto. As we mentioned in the stratagems, they can fight again for 2 CP, which can double the damage output of an already fairly fighty unit, and they get 4 rerolls to hit versus characters as well. The Zangor Enlightened are the version of them on the Discs of Tzeentch. They've got a sort of similar profile, but they're jump infantry with 2 wounds, and the way that I've most commonly seen them run is with their Assault 2, Strength 5, AP-1 Great Bows, where they have the interesting special rule where if you hit with a roll of a 6+, then the attack automatically gets a wound. This is great in combination with Prescience to give them +1 to hit, meaning that ability triggers more readily, and they can also access a further +1 to hit from a Zangor Shaman. So every single shot that these guys make that's hitting on a 4 will automatically wound the target at AP-1. This means that no matter how tough the target, these guys can go through it pretty efficiently if they are layered with buffs. Getting onto a couple of the special characters, and we have Ahriman, who's one of the single strongest models in the Thousand Suns army, and is one you'll typically see in competitive games. He's 130 points, or a bit more on a disc, and he's a Thousand Suns sorcerer that can cast and deny 3 powers, and he also gets +1 to his cast and deny tests, so he's just super reliable at being the heart of the army, getting off a whole load of key powers. On top of all that, he also allows nearby Thousand Suns units to reroll hit rolls of 1, so he's sort of a Lord and a Super Sorcerer all combined in one unit, and could be argued he's one of the strongest buffing characters in the whole game. The Primarch Magnus might not be quite as competitive as Ahriman. He's certainly a ludicrously dangerous threat on the board, with a massive 16-inch movement, 18 wounds, toughness 7 and a 4+ invul save, and he's just ridiculously strong in close combat, where he'll quickly go through just about any armoured target with ease. He gets +2 to cast, though this does degrade with his wounds. He can cast 4 powers per turn, and if he uses Smite then it goes off with D6 mortal wounds rather than just D3, and if he rolls over 10, then that goes up to a whopping 2d6. To make other Thousand Suns Psychers even better around him, he also rerolls 1s to hit for them, and they can also reroll 1s for psychic tests. Magnus can be very hard to deal with for slightly less experienced players. His main issue from a competitive point of view is that he is liable to being gunned straight off the table if you focus fire enough. He is no easy target to take down, that's true, particularly if you're using that -1 to hit and +1 to invul save on him. but if you do manage to bring him down, then that's a large chunk of the Thousand Suns army gone all in one go. The Thousand Suns fairly recently gained access to the Mutalith Vortex Beast. This guy's a 14 wound critter with toughness 7, a 4+ save and a 5+ invul, so he's reasonably tanky, but for the 125 point price tag he doesn't really do a whole ton. He can either spit out 1 mortal wound to every unit within 9 inches of him, or he can give a few minor buffs to nearby Thousand Suns units. He can do a little bit of close combat, but is not exactly excessive, and in general he's not the most threatening thing in the Thousand Suns army. In general, if you're facing one, then most of the other units are likely to be the thing that you want to shoot before this guy, even though he looks big and scary. Finally, Thousand Suns Demon Princes are certainly a force to be feared, although to be fair they have increased slightly in points as of the latest chapter approved. Any Demon Prince is moderately scary in close combat. These Thousand Suns ones all come with a 4+ invul save as stock, which means that they're a lot harder to shift than average, and can of course add to the weight of psychic powers manifested by the army. As normal, even if they're just throwing out smite, then it's not a bad thing at all. You frequently see multiple of these guys run in a Thousand Suns Supreme Command detachment, along with Ahriman himself, buffing other Chaos units, and just generally being strong melee threats, and these certainly remain some of the strongest things that are available in Thousand Suns, and the things that turn up most commonly in competitive lists. In general, Demon Princes are going to be a pain to deal with. They're very tough characters, and can hide behind enemy units, so I'd certainly shoot them if they are exposed, but a lot of the time they're not going to be, behind some sort of chaff screen. I didn't mention it on this list here, but they also get access to cultists, who are very much a staple troops choice for filling out battalions in the Thousand Suns, and they most certainly have the power to provide this screen. In terms of warlord traits, the Thousand Suns have access to quite a lot of decent ones, most of which are stat line buffs to the HQ that they're buffing. Particularly handy on a Demon Prince, there's one that gives -1 damage, meaning that they're going to be a right nightmare to put down. There's a useful one that's just knowing 1 additional power of change. One that can give you +1 to your invul save, so you could have a Demon Prince with a 3+ invul, and one that just gives you a flat buff of +1 to cast, which is always going to be handy to have another strongly casting sorcerer. Thousand Suns can get 2 of these with the Magister strat now, so I typically expect to see multiple ones of these on the table. In terms of relics, they have a few boosted weapons, but probably the single biggest one to be aware of is the Dark Matter Crystal. This is basically a crafty redeployment option, where the Thousand Suns player can redeploy the bearer and 1000 Suns infantry units that's nearby them, and they can immediately deep strike 9 inches from the enemy. This can be very powerful on big blobs of Zangors, where with their +1 to charge they can suddenly be charging your backlines out of absolutely nowhere, but it's certainly powerful enough on things like Rubric Marines and Scarab Terminators, and of course it allows the character to redeploy themselves as well. Another good one for the Thousand Suns is the Helm of the Third Eye, which is one of the command point farming ones, where they'll be getting command points back on a 5+ for each stratagem that you spend. Now from the Ritual of the Damned book, the main thing that the Thousand Suns got were access to 9 different cults of magic. Each detachment can only be from 1 cult of magic, and they each get access to 1 additional psychic power, 1 warlord trait, and 1 relic or sorcerer's arcana, in addition to all the ones that the Thousand Suns have. I'll go through them each quickly now, highlighting things that I think are the strongest. First of all, and perhaps one of the strongest of the cults, is the Cult of Magic. This one adds to the mortal wound damage output with an excellent psychic power called Astral Blast. It's only warp charge 6, it's 9-inch range but 15 inches with their buff. The target unit gets D3 mortal wounds, and every enemy unit within 3 inches gets 1 mortal wound as well. Much like Infernal Gateway, you can really punish closely packed formations, and by using that Chaos Familiar, you could potentially stack both of them on 1 sorcerer, and shower a tightly packed enemy formation with an enormous amount of mortal wounds. You could even synergize this with their Warlord trait, which again is excellent, and it is Devastating Sorcery. This one gives a nice simple +1 mortal wound to all powers cast. Now unless I'm mistaken, I believe that if you do stack this with casting their own Astral Blast power, then it means that they'll cast D3 +1 mortal wounds on the initial unit, and every unit within 3 inches will then take 2 mortal wounds, as they are units taking mortal wounds from a psychic power. Admittedly, this would require your Warlord trait and Sorcerer being right up close to the enemy, but it could be a very silly amount of mortal wounds going towards the enemy formations. On top of all this, they also get a relic, which is Arcane Focus, which is a nice simple +1 to cast, which I think is another very strong one and very viable in competition with the other relics. I really think that the Cult of Magic is very strong. It's very simple to use, just throwing mortal wounds around, and it's one of the ones that I'd be most tempted to use in competitive play. Next we have the Court of Prophecy. These guys have an incredibly useful psychic power as well in Divine the Future. It's warp charge 6, and it gets you 1 additional reroll that you can use for a hit roll, wound roll, or something like that, or to help you cast a psychic power. They do have to use it before their next psychic phase, however. It'd be very useful to have just one of the psychers pumping this out each turn. Their warlord trait isn't really up to much, it's just 6-inch movement after Overwatch, which does mean that they'd be hard to charge admittedly, but I'm not sure it's worth passing up something that's a bit more aggressive in nature. But I do quite like their piece of Sorceress Arcana, the Pythic Brazier, where each time a 1000 Suns unit within 6 inches attacks, you can choose to have one reroll either to hit, wound or damage. It's sort of like a slightly weaker version of Salamander type rerolls within 6 inches, and it certainly makes the Sorcerer into a pretty decent buffing character. Next we have the Cult of Knowledge, whose psychic power is Psychic Delve, which is sort of like a debuff to help you cause additional damage to one enemy unit. It allows you to reroll wound rolls of 1 against that target. Again, a pretty strong psychic power if you're just about to drown that target in Inferno Bolt of Fire. Their warlord trait is Ardent Scholar, which is reroll results of 1 for psychic tests. Not the strongest buff to casting in the world, but I think it will genuinely save command points over the course of several games, so perhaps not the worst one to have. I'm not the biggest fan of their relic though, I'm afraid. It's a souped up Warp Flame pistol. It will cause extra damage if you're right up next to the enemy, but that's not necessarily where sorcerers want to be. Next we have the Cult of Time, whose psychic power meshes very well with the Rubric A and the Scarab Cult Terminators. Time Flux is only warp charge 5 to cast, and it means that a unit within 12 inches will resurrect one model that was slain previously in the game with 4 wounds remaining. And if you do cast it on a 9 or more, then it means that you can resurrect D3 models. This is actually going to be really powerful, particularly on the Scarab Cult Terminators, who if you do manage to get a bit lucky, you could be returning multiple 30+ point models to the game each turn, which is just an insane amount of benefits for one cast. Their warlord trait is Immaterial Echo, which means that if they cast on a 9+, then they can cast 1 extra psychic power that phase. It's not bad, but it's somewhat unreliable to be honest, and the third psychic power might not even be one that you necessarily even care about casting all that much. But their relic is very interesting indeed. It's the Hourglass of Manat, and basically the first time this bearer is slain, you automatically resurrect with D3 wounds left. A lot of other similar rules mean that you have to roll to see if it happens, but this one you don't. They just get straight back up after they've been slain the first time. I imagine that could be very annoying and potentially very scary if this happens with a Demon Prince in the middle of enemy lines, where they'll be free to move, smite and charge something else to death next turn before they finally get put down. Next we have the Cult of Change, who I'm afraid I'm not quite as big a fan of their psychic power. Disturb Reality is an 18-inch cast range in 1000 Suns, and it's just -1 leadership and -1 attack. I guess it's potentially useful if your opponent does have some sort of combat Death Star units, but personally I'd just rather kill more enemy models with Smite and reduce their attacks that way. Fickle Nature is a trait that allows them to reroll charges and fall back and then shoot or charge next turn. Reroll charges could certainly be handy on a Demon Prince, but I still might prefer the generic trait that allows you to advance and charge as well. The Capricious Crest is quite an interesting one though. This is an 18-inch aura, where it allows you to swap a 1 for a 6 when you cast a psychic power with any model within this range, so it means your psychers will cast a little bit better, and also do the opposite for your opponents, where if they roll a 6 for a psychic power within 18 inches, then that can turn into a 1. So a pretty decent casting buff, with a pretty decent casting debuff as well on the same model. I'd say this is the best thing about them, otherwise the Cult of Change aren't my favourite to be honest. Next we have the Cult of Mutation, which I've mistakenly written as the Cult of Manipulation here. It is Mutation, sorry. And their psychic power is Warp Reality, which has a warp charge 6. It has to be cast on an enemy unit within 3 inches of a terrain feature, but until the start of your next psychic phase, the movement characteristic is halved, and you -1 from advance and charge rolls. Movement debuffs are pretty powerful, particularly on a slowish enemy combat unit, but it is a little bit annoying that they have to be within 3 inches of terrain, which could prevent a 1000 Suns player from using this on their ideal target. It's quite nice how this is fairly unrestricted though. A lot of similar rules prevent you from using it on Titanic or Fly units, and this one can do it on both. Their warlord trait is Touch of Vicissitude, which is one that gives a mortal wound on any hit rolls of 6s, so for Demon Princes and things it might realistically equate to an extra mortal wound per turn. Not the best in my opinion. And their Exalted Mutation relic is for a sorcerer, giving them +1 strength, toughness and attack, so it makes them a little bit fightier, but it wouldn't necessarily make me want to throw them right into the heart of battle still. Again, I'm not sure that these ones are going to be ones that are run very often. Next we have the Cult of Duplicity, which on the other hand I think are very strong. Sorcerer's Facade allows you to redeploy a unit via Deep Strike that's within 6 inches of the sorcerer, so it could be an interesting and slightly less expensive way of getting units to redeploy, such as the Dark Matter Crystal, and you could even combine it with the Dark Matter Crystal and maybe Webway Infiltration to have an absolute ton of 1000 Suns units coming out of Deep Strike all at once. Their warlord trait is good too, which is Duplicitous Tactician, which allows you to redeploy D3 units at the start of the game, which means that if you see Cult of Duplicity units on the table, they might be moving before the game begins, so you can't be 100% certain of exactly where they're going to be. And their relic, the Perfidious Tome, allows you to roll the dice each turn. On a 4+, the Thousand Suns player gains a command point. On a 1, the opponent gains a command point. So I'd say this one's typically usually going to be worth it if you're only buying it in for 1 command point, and the bearer survives a few turns. 8th on the list, we have Cult of Scheming. They have seeded strategy for a psychic power, which allows fallback and shoot and charge. Like a lot of fallback and shoot abilities, it's very nice to have, but just a bit situational to be planning on it right from turn 1 in my opinion. Grand Schemer, which is an Auspex ability, which could give units like Scarabus Cult Terminators objective secured, and anything that already has objective secured can count as 2 models each. Personally, I wouldn't bother with this one myself. And their relic is Chakwithor's Theorem, which is a once per game ability to use a powerful stratagem and counts as 0 command points. Could be handy for using those Zangors to fight twice or something. Finally, we get onto the actual Cult of Manipulation. Their psychic power is Attempted Possession, which is Warp Charge 6, and it allows 1 mortal wound on a character, and that character is -2 to cast. Potentially could be a useful one to pick in if they are fighting enemy psychers. Their trait is Beguiling Influence, which is -1 attacks from an enemy unit within 1 inch of them. I suppose could be handy on a Demon Prince, but I'd probably rather give him something just to give him more raw damage output or durability myself. And their relic is kind of interesting but not that strong. Sorthis' Reflector. It allows the bearer to take the profile of one of the enemy's weapons and use it against them. A bit underwhelming in my opinion, because it means that you're likely to be the same or worse than the enemy that you're fighting. So an absolute ton of rules to take in there for the Thousand Suns, I know. I think it's helpful just to be aware that this stuff does exist, so when it comes up in game it's not too much of a surprise. As a general takeaway, I prepare for Risen Rubrique in the midfield right from turn 1, potentially made very hard to kill with combination of powers and the +1 to their Invul stratagem. I look out for Thousand Suns units jumping all over the board with the Dark Matter Crystal, Webway Infiltration and potentially Sorcerer's Facade. If you've got an elite army, you really need to think about trying to weather that barrage of smites and potentially trying to screen with the least expensive units in your army. And don't forget spoiler powers such as Warp Time and Death Hex, which could really get a jump on your units. I think that all of these cults of the Legion are fairly hard to remember, so basically if you see that your opponent has multiple different cults in different attachments, it's perfectly reasonable to ask them what psychic powers, traits and relics those cults have, to better prepare you and make you understand what sort of things might be coming on the other side of the table, whether you might be having Scarab Cult Terminators regenerating and getting back up again, or the Cult of Magic using Astral Blasts to rain down tons of mortal wounds on you. I think understanding Thousand Suns a little bit better is certainly going halfway to beating them, rather than just waiting for them to do their psychic phase and seeing what nasty things happen. Thanks very much for listening to an Auspex Tactics video. If I have made any errors or misunderstandings in the making of this, please let me know down in the comments, as there are quite a lot of complex rules and interactions going on with all of these psychic powers, relics and warlord traits. If you've been enjoying the videos, feel free to subscribe for more. We'll certainly have plenty more Know Your Enemy type videos coming out in the future. And if you have been enjoying all the videos recently, then I'd just like to mention the channel's Patreon page. It is what allows me to keep these videos coming so regularly, as the channel's Patreon supporters allow me to spend more time on this than my real world job. In addition to allowing me to make more videos, you also get to see 1 video per week early. There's the opportunity to vote in polls for what sort of videos come next on the channel, and there's the occasional prize draw where I post out some miniatures to one Patreon. If any of that sounds good at all, then the link is in the description, and a massive thank you to my current Patreons for making the channel possible. In any case, a big thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.